Well, Anna was asking me about how should she pronounce my last name, Jesus. And I told her, well, as you want, because I've been living in so many countries that now I'm used to being called Jésus, Yesu, Jesus, Jesus, so it doesn't matter. All right, so now I'm working at the OECD, which is also a global entity. I'm going to speak to you about the work we've done at the OECD related to green growth and the perspective of green growth for the agricultural system. But first, let us have a look at the question of the seminar, feeding the future, and is producing enough to feed the world an issue? And this was somehow related to the question at hand. So we did some simulation recently with the model to calculate the impact of climate change on yields and on agriculture in general. And as you can see here, compared to a situation without climate change, having climate change on board will reduce the average yield and increases the price because of reduction of yield. But at the same time, if you compare the situation with situation without climate change, we see that malnutrition would still reduce compared to today, and that the calories consumption per capita will still improve compared to today, even in, and especially in sub-Saharan Africa. So basically, the issue is not much about feeding the future, so in itself, but what is the issue then? And as our colleague from Yara mentioned, there's something specific about agriculture compared to a lot of other sectors, is that agriculture requires and impacts a lot on natural resources. As you can see here, for OECD countries and non-OECD countries, the use of, although the GDP sometimes is not so much, especially in OECD countries for the agriculture sector, the use of the different resources, whether it's land, water, the impact on GHG emissions, all the ammonia emissions at the bottom is important for agriculture. Now, can we produce more without hampering future production potential? And we insisted earlier on improving productivity. And here you could see an example for all the OECD countries over the last 20 years, where you can see that crop production, that you can see is in the dotted line, increased over 20 years, while at the same time the consumption of inorganic fertilizer decreased. So this is good news. Now, the issue beside this good news is rather than producing more and enough, the issue will be producing in a sustainable way. So this is one of the reasons and one of the applications we have for the green growth framework that the OECD has developed. What is green growth and how does OECD see green growth? Basically, for the OECD, green growth is how to foster economic growth and development, while at the same time ensuring that the natural assets that continue to provide the resources, can continue to provide the resources and the environmental services on which we depend as human beings. To do this, we have to catalyze investment, innovation, because this is what underpins growth, but we have to do it in a sustainable way. Now, basically, if I would have to show you on a graph what is the concept of green growth, the idea is to accept to have a slightly lower growth at the beginning, to maintain the natural assets and natural capital enough so that in the future we can reach higher growth level than what would have been the business as usual scenario. So this is the theory. For agriculture, what it means is that we have to be able to provide enough food, feed, fiber, fuel for 9 million people in 2050, which means that we will have a greater pressure on land, water, all the natural resources, while at the same time ensuring resilience of the impact of climate change and limiting the harmful impact and enhancing the beneficial impact of agriculture. So to do this, as was emphasized earlier, the key element will be to improve resource productivity, to have a resource productivity increase faster than population income to reduce environmental footprints. So this is somehow some form of sustainable intensification. And we need policies and markets to work together to give the right incentive to all the stakeholders, the farmers and the companies, to go in that direction. So what policies can be used? Because at the OECD, I don't know if you're aware of, but the main goal of the OECD is better policies for better lives. So what policies for sustainable and resilient productivity increase? So today, what we see is that most of the markets, the way they function, they do not correctly price the natural resources and environmental externalities, whether they are positive or negative. And in the case of agriculture, we have also positive externality, positive benefit for the environment. So whether it's greenhouse gas emission, water biodiversity, it's rarely priced in the market. And we often have inappropriate or ineffective regulation policies, governance structure that hinder the efficient use of natural resources. So tomorrow, what we want to have, tomorrow we have to address 3 policy sets. One is to reform existing policies, especially those that are environmentally harmful, and I'm thinking especially about subsidies and production distortive. Second is to implement instruments, market, taxes that put a correct price on the natural resources. And second is to find the incentive, the sufficient incentive, to incentivize environmental services production while increasing food production at the same time. We identify, as of now, a few policy elements that we put into a policy toolkit that are key, and we want to emphasize and work further with the governments. The first set is a series of policies that can both support green and growth, the environmental part and the productive part. So first, we have policies that encourage research and development and innovation. These can be fostered and developed to reinforce the green and growth. We have measures targeted to economic adaptation, change of practices, if you will, of farmers and farm households, the different stakeholders. Think of, for instance, training, advisory services, extension. And also we have openness to trade and investment. This may not seem straightforward to you, but think about if you have a country, I'm taking an example that was mentioned earlier, if you have a country that is very efficient in natural resource use, and you have market barriers that limit the quantity of product this country can produce and export to other countries, will end up in a situation where in countries where producing the same thing is not natural resource efficient, will increase, and this will have a bad impact on the environment compared to what we could have. Now, beside those policies that can reinforce both, we have also a set of policies that we need to push further, which are specifically aimed at the greening of growth. These are market-based instruments, such as agri-environmental payments, environmental taxes, and also non-market instruments. Think about regulation, voluntary agreements, technical assistance. One example that we worked on recently about how to help agriculture adapt to climate change. So we looked at what the different OECD countries were doing, what were the good examples, the bad examples, and I tried here to sum up some of the conclusions we have. So government main role first would be providing an enabling environment to the farmers. And the key element there is to have well-informed private agents, so farmers, companies, making timely, efficient adaptation decisions. This means that the government should ensure that it's possible to disseminate accurate and detailed information on the risks and consequences of climate change, but also on the technologies and practices that can be used to adapt to climate change. And this is one of the key roles the public policies could help support. One other role that policies should focus on in terms of helping agriculture adapt to climate change is to remove the disincentive to farmers' adaptive actions. And here, I want to mention especially the policies that are providing subsidies to insurance for farm activities. Because in many cases, insurance to farm activities go beyond what would be economically necessary to kickstart a market of insurance. And going beyond that, they push farmers to take more risks than necessary because it's insured. And this is not good news for the farmers in the future to adapt to climate change. So these also should be looked at. And in the end, one other role of the policy could be to provide tools to help farmers assess and manage their risk. But this is related to the information part I mentioned earlier. Now, are we going in the right direction? And here, I want to mention a bit what we do in terms of monitoring what is happening in terms of green growth. So we have set up, I won't detail you this whole big slide, but we have set up a framework of indicators to look at green growth. The four first elements we look at is the productivity of the environmental resources. So it can be productivity of land, productivity of water, but beyond that, it's also some indicators that we call multi-factor productivity, because if you look only productivity of one factor, such as water or nutrients, you end up in situations like, for instance, in Australia, when they had a few years ago a big drought, the water efficiency suddenly increased. Is it good news? I'm not sure. So we need to have a broader set of indicators. So we are also looking at the development of indicators for the natural asset base, land, water, etc. The environmental dimension of the quality of life, health-related issues, issues related to environment, and economic opportunities and policy responses. What do we have in terms of what's happening in agriculture for the OECD countries? Globally, you see here we have increase over the last 25 years. We have an increase of production, while at the same time, all the different environmental indicators here have improved. Being to the negative, it means an improvement. So this is rather good news for the environment and the efficiency. But at the same time, if you look at the support provided to agriculture in the OECD countries, you see something good, which is harmful support measures for agriculture, harmful for the environment, have decreased, while beneficial measures for the environment have increased. But harmful measures, harmful support, still account for 50% of the total in the OECD, and most beneficial for the environment measures only account for 10%. So there's room for improvement still there. Now, one example of the type of indicators we have is here what we see in terms of decoupling. Decoupling means that, for instance, the value added and productivity of the agriculture sector over the last 20 years has increased, while at the same time, the greenhouse gas emissions has decreased. So here we can improve, we have been able to improve production while at the same time decreasing emissions. And we can develop graphs like this that show the situation of different countries and compare and differentiate countries where we have an absolute decoupling, this is what we see, and a relative decoupling where it's not a decrease of the emissions, but a lower increase compared to the production increase. So this is the type of output we can produce. Now, one example I wanted to highlight with you very quickly is the example of the Netherlands. The Netherlands, as you can see in the graph, is also one of those countries where the nutrient balance and the pressure associated to it improve over the time. And if you look more in detail with on nitrogen, for instance, you look at here at the nitrogen inputs per hectare, which decrease over time, with a strong decrease during this period. And here you have the gross nitrogen balance in green. And this is the output. So this one is the difference between the output and the input. And here you see, although the input has a tendency to decrease, the balance is about straight, suddenly decrease at the same time with this sharp decrease, and then is flat again and slightly decrease after that. And here in the Netherlands, we had a new policy put in place. This is a policy where before, when you had some quotas and indications about the use of manure, here the Netherlands government had put in place a system which was more stringent, assessing the balance of minerals in each farm and developing penalties for those overshooting and providing support for those that were doing the right thing. And this had a tremendous impact on the use of nitrogen. The bad news is that this policy has been slashed. Well, I don't know if it's a bad news, but for the environment related to this, its efficiency, the government had to completely reform this policy because it was not compatible with the EU policy, and it had been criticized also a lot by the farmers. Now, we've seen encouraging trends. Now, is it good? Is it sufficient? Is decoupling the way we've seen sufficient? and is business as usual sustainable? These are elements that I wanted to raise with you because there are still things that we need to pay attention to that are not solved. One is, although agricultural productivity is still growing, it's growing slower than it used to. And nobody can explain today why. There are studies that are trying to differentiate what is the impact of climate change, what is the impact of other factors, but it's not clear, and we need to work on this to make sure we're not going into a bad direction. The natural capital long-term evolution is still, well, we're looking at it, but it's still a question to be looked further. And another critical element that we need to take into account is when I showed you the impact of climate change, this was the average impact of climate change. Now, beyond the average impact of climate change, you have extreme events related to climate change that will have a disruptive, potentially, impact on agricultural production at the global level. And we still don't know how to deal with them in terms of policies, and we still don't know how to predict them. And I'm finished with my presentation. I would just want to highlight some work we're going to do over the next 2 years, because it might interest you if you want to collaborate and discuss with us further. So one work we're going to start soon is improving productivity and natural resource efficiency of the agro-food sector with a focus on energy use efficiency. Work on identifying future water risks hotspot for agriculture, places where production is important, but the risk associated with agriculture and water are important too. There's another group in the OECD who is looking at a holistic view of the impact of nitrogen on health, the environment, and the associated policy responses. And there's been some work, especially with the push of the Netherlands government on the water, energy, and land use nexus, the mix between the three. That's it. Thank you very much for your attention.